Hello everybody, Chris here, Happy New Year. Today I'll be doing a book review on Viktor Frankl's The Feeling of Meaninglessness. And for those who maybe don't recognize the name, you might recognize Frankl from his most famous book, Man's Search for Meaning, which is a book about how Frankl endured the concentration camps as best he could, using his psychological theory of logotherapy as a therapeutic resource to help him and his fellow victims through that struggle. But this is a different book by Viktor Frankl, in which it goes more into detail in Frankl's theory of logotherapy. And as best I can tell, this actually isn't a book by Viktor Frankl, which I thought it was when I originally picked it up. It's actually a collection of essays collected by a man named Alexander Batthyany. Could be pronouncing the last name wrong. And it's like I said, it's a collection of essays published by Frankl originally in the 60s and early 70s. And the book also features a about 30-page introduction by Batthyany, which gives a brief biography of Frankl's philosophical and psychological thought, which I found very interesting because it sort of started from his college years and then showed you how his ideas changed through his career and obviously through his experiences in concentration camps during the Second World War. But like I said, the essays in this book are from the 60s, 70s. They're sort of later Frankl than the Frankl who was writing about his experiences in the concentration camps. And also, because these are academic essays, whereas Man's Search for Meaning was a psychology book that was meant more for the masses and sort of common reading, as opposed to psychologists and philosophers who might be reading these essays collected. They go more into depth into, like I said, Frankl's philosophical thought and therapeutic thought. Now, if you have no idea what I'm talking about, Viktor Frankl proposed this theory of psychology, or at least of psychological therapy, called logotherapy. I believe I'm pronouncing that correct. Also called existential therapy or existential analysis therapy, stuff like that. And as you might gather from the name existential therapy, the basic premise, the gist, is that Frankl proposed that in a therapeutic setting, psychologists or therapists should try to promote a meaningful life into the patient, or if it's sort of a self-help type of thing, as it was for Frankl in the concentration camps, you want to focus on the meaningfulness of actions and even the meaningfulness of suffering. And the idea was that by focusing on the meaningfulness of stuff, it sort of robs suffering of its bite, so to speak. And not only did Frankl propose sort of this theory, existential theory, as a system of therapy and sort of theory of happiness almost, it's also framed, although that's sort of the interface of logotherapy, logotherapy itself is really a collection of ideas, a collection of premises that all revolve around basically two things. Man's spirituality, or at least immateriality, and also the value or the importance of meaning in human life because of our spirituality, because of the aspect of human nature that is outside of the physical animalistic realm, according to Frankl. And I thought that sort of background information about logotherapy is really what's the focus of these essays, in addition to the theory about how making a therapeutic patient realize how meaningful their life is, or at least take action so that their life becomes meaningful in their eyes. In addition to that aspect of logotherapy, the essays collected in The Feeling of Meaninglessness they really dive deep into Frankl's thought and sort of the behind-the-scenes axioms of logotherapy. And I'm just going to talk briefly about those premises. Like I already said sort of my two main takeaways from it. But Frankl really goes after the sort of contemporary theories of his time, or at least of the time that his career was starting, I think, which were the theories of Adler and Freud, and to a certain extent Jung as well. And he frames Freud's theory as a psychological theory of pleasure, and Adler's theory as a psychological theory of power, and dubs Freud's sort of psychological motive for human nature as the will to pleasure, and Adler's as the will to power. And he also has Jung in a sort of a sideways way also falling under the umbrella of a will to power type of psychological theory. But for Frankl, the will to power and the will to pleasure, while those are real important aspects of human nature, are secondary to the more fundamental psychological drive for human nature, which is the will to meaning, as Frankl puts it. And the will to meaning, in addition to being the real source of happiness for Frankl, which is, like I said, sort of the interface of logotherapy, that meaning is happiness, it's also what drives us psychologically as human beings. While an animal might be constrained because of they're entirely physical, according to Frankl, by the will to power and or the will to meaning, the will to power and or the will to pleasure, the human animal being spiritual, having a sort of spiritual element to it, and not being able to be reduced to mere physicality, has a sort of transcendental will. So the will to power and the will to pleasure, according to Frankl, are more internal and they're more selfish, whereas the will to meaning, while it can benefit the individual, it's more outward looking. He says it's a way of transcending the self, which sounds very esoteric, but it's not. The book is really quite graspable by anybody capable of reading Man's Search for Meaning, for sure. It isn't super academic in the sense that you can't understand what he's saying. And I'm just going to read a few passages that I thought exemplified some of these points. So, for example, on Freud, he says, Freud and consequently his epigons have taught us always to see something behind or beneath human volitions, unconscious motivations, underlying dynamics. Freud never took a human phenomenon at its face value. And I think that last part there about Freud not taking human beings at their face value is Frankl's key criticism of psychology, modern psychology, or at least the psychological paradigms at the time that he was writing. So Freud, if you were on Freud's couch telling him about your problems, he would talk about some underlying meaning, problems with your mother, problems with your childhood, which for Frankl, that's sort of disrespectful, because you're not allowing the patient the respect of having their own problems be under their own control, really. And he says the same thing about Adler and the will to power, saying that me wanting to do good in school is really the will to power exemplifying itself because I want to be in control or be at the top of my class, sort of disrespects my own motivations for doing well in school, which might be X, Y, or Z. Which also ties into another aspect of Frankl, which is that he argues for the freedom of the will. He's a libertarian in the free will sense of the debate, as opposed to a determinist. And he argues that his sort of dualism, in the sense that seeing man as both physical and spiritual, allows the free will argument to sustain, whereas under a purely physicalist, materialist worldview, as was the current paradigm at the time of his writing, that sort of sustains more of a deterministic result, and that deterministic philosophy then has consequences in the field of psychology and therapy. where we see man's psychological motive as being reduced to something sort of behind the scenes, the man behind the curtain, the ego or superego, something like that. And also, in addition to psychological motives, also are, what was I going to say? I forget the second part. Not important. Let me read another passage, though. Let's see. Okay, so, insofar as logotherapy is concerned, its concept of man is based on 3 pillars. 1, freedom of will. 2, will to meaning. And 3, meaning of life. So freedom of the will obviously has to do with free will. Will to meaning has to do with sort of a psychological theory that man is motivated towards meaning. And then the third pillar being meaning of life, in which Frankl postulates that it is meaning and not, for instance, pleasure or satisfaction which determines happiness. And then he goes on to say, they are opposed to those 3 principles which characterize the bulk of current approaches to man, namely, 1, pandeterminism, as I am used to call it, 2, homeostasis theory, and 3, reductionism. So he sort of puts his 3 pillars in opposition to, like I said, the current psychological paradigm at the time of his writings, which was physicalistic, deterministic, and also reductionist. And I think that even though the names and theories from at the time of Frankl's writing to the time of today are different, for example, we talk more about evolutionary psychology today than we do about psychoanalysis. At the same time, though, I think Frankl's main theme is still relevant today in terms of how his theory of logotherapy can still be used in juxtaposition with the behind-the-scenes psychological motivations of evolutionary theory or of sort of the more current reductionist chemical theories in psychology today. So let me read 2 or 3 more passages from it. Let's see. What do I got on this page? Okay, so now he's talking about so sort of what I was just talking about, the idea of reductionism, and which also leads to physicalism and determinism. The 3 are kind of intermingled in psychology today at Frankl's time. And he says that this leads to something he calls nothing butness. So he says, there is a danger inherent in the teaching of man's nothing butness, the theory that man is nothing but the result of biological, psychological, and sociological conditions, or the product of heredity and environment. That which is a product, however, is a robot, not a human being. He argues that the psychological sort of fashion of his day and today, I think, is to not see a human being as a person, but to see them more as a, he uses the term robot, which might be a little condescending, but at the same time, I don't think he's too far off the mark, insofar as Freudian psychology, evolutionary psychology, modern biopsychology sort of sees mankind as a being who can be influenced by sort of those behind-the-scenes things. And even if that is true, I think Frankl raises a good point that we should be cautious of that. And I think Frankl raises a good point that those things can lead to disrespect of patients or disrespect of the human animal. All right, one more passage to close it out. Let's see. What do I got over here? Oh, so talking about sort of reductionist psychology, he says, the great psychiatrist Dubois once said so rightly, "Of course one can manage without all that and still be a doctor. But one should realize that then the only thing that makes us different from a veterinary surgeon is the clientele." So I thought that was funny. Frankl's quoting this guy Dubois and essentially saying that when we treat the human being as something that can be reduced to these sort of hidden psychological motivations, then, like he says, the only difference between a vet and a psychologist is the clientele. So Viktor Frankl's The Feeling of Meaninglessness, which is, like I said, a collection of his essays, I am going to rate it a 3 out of 5. Even though I really did like it a lot and was kind of wanted to give it a 4 out of 5 based on the content, a lot of the essays, while I'm glad that they were all included, were sort of repetitive. I think Frankl repeats himself a lot, and I think that's in part just due to the fact that these essays were intended to be independent. So someone reading one essay in, say, a psychological journal, academic journal, Frankl didn't want them to have to be familiar with his theory and all of his other essays and books. So he sort of repeated stuff at the beginning of all the essays a little bit. But in terms of being now in an anthology here, it can be a little repetitive to hear the same stuff over and over. And also, I would have liked a little more from, Batthyany, the editor, who did a really great introduction. I would have enjoyed the introduction, or maybe a conclusion, having more about how Frankl might be relevant to psychology today in now 2020. Or at the time when this was published, I believe 2010. So that would have been a really interesting chapter and a really interesting conversation to talk about. How Frankl is still perceived in psychology today, which my understanding is not super optimistically. And also how Frankl's writing might be relevant to psychology today, or even to the philosophy of mind, or metaphysics. Which brings me to another point. The books I read are mostly philosophy, far more than psychology. So one reason I find myself drawn to Frankl's psychological literature is because of the connections with philosophy. So if you're someone who enjoys reading philosophy, which you might be if you're watching my channel, I would say go check out Viktor Frankl, The Feeling of Meaninglessness, or some of his other work, such as Man's Search for Meaning, which, by the way, I've read a long time ago, and I want to reread it before I do a review for you guys. So I'll do that soon, maybe now that I finish this one. And then there was one other criticism I was going to say about the book. Oh, the other criticism I had was of Frankl's theory itself, which is that sometimes he'll rail against the reductionism and determinism without proposing an argument about why they're wrong. Like, there's a difference between something being false and something being bad, and something being true and something being good, in philosophy at least. True and false pertain to facts. They pertain to truth, if something is or isn't the case. Whereas bad and good are terms used in application with the field of ethics or morality. And I think that sometimes when Frankl, like I said, rails against determinism, reductionism, and what was the other one? Biologism. I think sometimes he'll say how they're bad for disrespecting man, for not treating the human being with the respect that it deserves, without giving the argument about why that theory is false. So saying that Freud is bad because he doesn't respect the inherent value of a human being, maybe he doesn't treat them as an end in itself, from Kant. That's not the same as saying that Freud's theory is wrong. And he does do a lot of that more factual, true-false argumentation in this work and throughout his essays. But I think that there are points where he makes more of a moral argument without clarifying, without properly demarcating between his moral argument and his more factual, truth-based argument. So I wish Frankl had done that a little more. And that's it. So 3 out of 5, The Feeling of Meaninglessness. If you like Frankl, or if you're interested in existential psychology, check it out. Thanks for watching.